Hello and welcome to Top Story. Just how serious is George W. Bush about fighting global warming? After all, it was he who led the opposition to the Kyoto Protocol and he who expressed the greatest doubts about the scientific evidence of climate change. This year, though, has seen a shift in the US position. Washington appears now to accept that global warming is a reality. But is Bush prepared to accept the principle of obligatory cutbacks in emissions? The answer to those questions may become a little clearer today. Bush has invited 11 countries, the European Union and the UN, to attend a high-level conference in Washington to begin the process of defining a strategy for combating climate change. But the fact that the conference comes so soon after this week's UN summit on global warming has aroused suspicions that Bush wants to sidetrack the UN agenda and replace it with a programme of voluntary national curbs on emissions. If so, he can expect a hostile reaction, not least from the EU. Well, joining me now to discuss the Washington conference and the Bush agenda on climate change is Cédric Philibert, an economist at the International Energy Agency. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. There are these suspicions about the US motives, but is it really an effort to sidetrack Bali?
Well, they protest it's not, and I think we should believe them and certainly act as if any kind of narrowing of differences could then be brought to the UN conference and the UN negotiating process.
I mean, his line is that it's not an attempt to sidetrack, it's in addition to Bali.
That's it.
So what is his position? What do you think that George Bush will want to get out of this meeting today in Washington?
Well, he tries to get some greater support for his own approach, which is very much on the voluntary side, while all others believe that it's important to agree on kind of targets for emission cuts in a close future.
I mean, one of the things that George Bush and the American side have been stressing is that voluntary targets are the real way forward, that imposing obligatory targets on states is not going to achieve what we all want.
But, you know, it has to be an agreement, and Kyoto is an agreement. Countries have agreed at Kyoto to undertake cuts, and that's what's needed in some sense because climate change is a global issue, and everyone has a permanent incentive to defect an agreement or to do as little as possible and consume as much fossil fuels as possible and let all other countries do the job. So it's normal that there is a negotiation and a kind of an agreement, but no target can be imposed on anyone in any case. So it always be voluntary.
Kyoto was seen, I suppose, in a way as a big turning point in the fight against global warming, but it was undermined too by the refusal of the United States to sign it.
Yeah.
Is the United States likely to be brought on board as we move towards the next stage, post-Kyoto?
My take on this is that Kyoto is not the final word. It's not the definitive architecture for future greenhouse gas mitigation architecture. In particular, it's very strong. You have fixed and binding targets. That doesn't work for developing countries and has not worked for Australia or the US. And of course, other countries must take these concerns in account. For example, you could get
you say they must do, but I mean, we had Nicolas Sarkozy talking the other day at the UN saying it was absolutely essential that everybody could come on board on the idea of obligatory cuts.
But obligatory cuts can be mitigated, for example, for developed countries with price caps that would say, well, we get to this target as long as the price to do that is not too high. And that would help get Australia or the US on board or keep Canada and Japan on board. And for developing countries, you probably need something different, a system that would provide incentives with no threat for the economic development. And we have thought at the IEA of non-binding targets that would be the basis for emissions trading, but developing countries would be potential sellers if they beat their targets, but they would not be obliged to buy on the international market if they cannot achieve their targets.
Well, you mentioned the developing countries, and of course one of the weaknesses of Kyoto, as the Americans have constantly pointed out, is it doesn't set targets for Brazil, India and China.
Yeah.
You know, China is almost producing as much in terms of emissions as the United States is now.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely critical. I mean, George Bush is arguing this very strongly, that they be brought into the equation.
And it's a fair point, but we have to find ways that fit to their needs to bring them on board, and that will help get the US and Australia again on board. We have to find new ways and to devise. Kyoto, exactly as it is not the final word. It has to be transformed, it has to be modified to accommodate various concerns.
Does it seem to you to be the case that the United States does seem to have accepted the overall argument now that there is scientific evidence that global warming is a reality and that something like Kyoto, or Kyoto 2, Bali if you like, is what's needed to counteract it, so multilateral international effort to combat it?
I see many signs in the US society that shows that since Katrina and Al Gore's tour. There are several bills before the Congress or the House that propose a big cap-and-trade system for the entire U.S. There are cities and states that are building new regulations and cap-and-trade systems as well in the Northeast and in the Western states for greenhouse gases. I see many signs in the U.S. that the U.S. is now getting ready to get seriously involved in the international negotiation and to do its job at home.
But is there still a slight difference in emphasis? I mean, the Americans are often talking about the need for developing new technologies rather than impose obligatory cutbacks.
There is no difference. I mean, if you want to get emission reduction, you will have to develop new technologies, and nobody challenges that. But can you just say we'll develop technologies and let them develop spontaneously in the society, or will there be a need for this technology to be pulled in the marketplace thanks to a carbon price? That's a big issue.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, do you think post-George Bush we're going to see America right on board with the rest of the world on climate change?
Most probably, I would say yes.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks very much to Cédric Philippert of the International Energy Agency. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye for now.